Hello friends, in an episode full of horror, where we see many types of torture and horrific methods of execution that are unbelievable in ancient times, where you see more than 40 methods of punishment that are truly chilling and chilling. Manius Aquilius, 88 BC. Aquilius rose to prominence as a general in the late Roman Republic and distinguished himself in 101 BC at the Battle of Aquae Sextae. In 88 BC, he was defeated at the Battle of Protostasium and attempted to flee to Italy. He reached as far as the island of Lesbos, where the local Greeks captured him and handed him over to his enemy Mithridates. Aquilius was put on a donkey and taken to the city of Pergamon to be humiliated. There, he was executed by having molten gold poured down his throat. The details of this method of execution are not recorded, but it can be safely assumed that the gold was instantly melted through his internal organs. This could have caused his esophagus and stomach to burst, possibly exploding from his stomach. Robert François Damien, 1757. The truly horrific execution of Robert François Damiens. Damien was 41 years old when he attempted to assassinate King Louis. Louis was wearing thick winter clothing and was barely injured, the blade only penetrating half an inch, but when Damien was tied up and arrested, Louis summoned a confessor and apologized to his wife for all the extramarital affairs he had had. Parliament convicted Damien, and on March 28 he was tortured for 4 hours. His legs and feet were crushed with wooden boots, and hot pincers were then used to tear off his flesh. Molten lead and boiling oil were poured into these wounds. His right hand was burned with molten sulfur. He was then handed over to Charles Sanson, the royal executioner, who tied Damien's naked body to 4 horses in the middle of Place de la Grève, where hundreds of spectators, including Giacomo Casanova, watched. Sanson cut off Damien's genitals and burned them, then ordered the horses led away in 4 directions. To tear his arms and legs from their sockets. But Damien's joints proved too tough. So, Sanson cut deep into his armpits and upper thighs, then the horses were led away again and torn to pieces. It was reported that Damien, now reduced to just a torso, was still alive and screaming when he was thrown into the fire. Georgi Duza, 1514. Duza was a cavalry commander in what is now Belgrade. In 1514, the Hungarian chancellor returned from Rome with a papal bull ordering the formation of an army to defeat the Ottomans. Duza was given this task, and in just a few weeks, he was able to assemble an army of about 40,000 peasants. However, the nobles did not provide the peasants with any food, clothing, or weapons, and still demanded that they do battle against the Ottomans. Eventually, the peasant crusaders revolted against their nobility and intended to defeat the Hungarian nobility, and even the king. Duza sided with the peasants, and their rebellion soon reached the scale of a national revolution. King Vladislaus responded by hastily assembling an army of mercenaries. Throughout the summer of 1514, Duza captured several cities and captured cannons. All the Hungarian nobility descended on him and defeated his army in July. Duza was captured and executed by being forced to sit naked on a flaming iron throne, wear a flaming iron crown, and hold a flaming iron scepter. This was to mock his royal ambition. Then his younger brother was hacked to death before him. The pincers were then heated in a fire and used to tear his flesh. 9 of his rebellious followers, who had already starved to death, were ordered to approach the throne and bite off its flesh and swallow it as the pincers cooked it. The few who refused were cut to pieces before the others, who then complied. After they ate pieces of his flesh, they were released. Duza was cooked to death on the throne. Bessus, 329 BC. Defeat of King Darius III, Persia falls to Alexander the Great. Bessus was the satrap, governor, of the easternmost province of Bactria of Darius' Persian Empire when it was conquered by Alexander the Great. While Alexander pursued Darius, the latter fled to Bactria, where he attempted to raise another army. However, Bessus tried to convince Darius to hand over military power to him. When Darius refused, Bessus speared him and left him mortally wounded as they fled. This disappointed Alexander, who wanted to capture Darius alive. He pursued Bessus deep into the east through Bactria. Bessus declared himself Artaxerxes V, king of Asia, and attempted to raise an army. However, he did not have enough time and continued his journey over the Hindu Kush. At Nautica, near Shahrasabs, Uzbekistan, Bessus' officers arrested him and handed him over to the pursuing Macedonians. Naked and bound, Bessus was taken to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, who ordered Bessus to be severely flogged in the village's public square. Bessus's nose and ears were then cut off, a traditional Persian punishment for treason. He was then taken back to Ecbatana, where Alexander ordered his execution by bending 2 large trees to the ground and tying his arms and legs to them, one side to each tree. The trees were then released and shot back up, slowly dismantling Bessus' body over the course of several days. Peter Nurse, 1581. Satanic cannibal bandit Peter Nurse. Nurse was a German serial killer who was executed on September 16, 1581, at Neumarkt in Oberpfalz Abbey, about 25 miles 40 kilometers southeast of Nuremberg. The locals greatly feared him as a powerful black magician in league with the devil. It is known for certain that he was one of the leaders of a gang of robbers/murderers that roamed the German countryside for years. He was captured in 1577 and tortured until he confessed to 75 murders but then escaped by unknown means. He was finally captured along with several other thieves and murderers at Newmarket, where he stayed at an inn. During 3 days of torture, he eventually confessed to committing 544 murders and cannibalism. On the first day, pincers were used to tear off strips of flesh from all over his body, and then hot oil was poured over these wounds. On the second day, his feet were anointed with hot oil and placed over embers, roasting them to the bone. On the third day, the steering wheel was broken. Breaking wheel procedures vary over time and from place to place. In his case, he was tied face up and naked to wooden stakes raised on the ground, raising his limbs a few inches. A large iron-rimmed cart wheel was then raised above him and struck on his arms and legs 42 times, crushing bones from hands to shoulders and feet to hips. Then, instead of wrapping his shattered limbs around the wheel's rim and spokes, they were simply cut off while he was still alive. Ling Chi. Slow cutting. Ling Chi was a brutal execution method used in China where the victim would suffer numerous wounds before finally dying from blood loss. The executioners were tasked with making as many cuts as possible and removing the strips of flesh without killing the victim. It was also known as death by 1,000 cuts. Ling Chi began in the 10th century and was banned in 1905. Since the beginning of the 20th century, it has been one of the few execution methods in this video for which there are actually pictures of its practice. There was no specific process behind Ling Chi. His experience depends on several factors, such as the skill and mercy of the executioner and the seriousness of the crime committed. Some records recovered from the Ming dynasty indicate that victims suffered as many as 3,000 wounds before death, while other reports claim that the entire ordeal took less than 15 minutes. Sometimes convicts were given opium, but it is unclear whether this was to make them suffer more or less. It would have kept them conscious longer. Lingshikan was one of the final forms of the 5 punishments, which was a measure of punishment that increased in severity. It included a range of punitive measures, including amputation of the nose or feet, exile, tattooing, and even castration, hanging, drawing and quartering. According to English law, this would be the maximum punishment for a man convicted of high treason. The woman was burned at the stake instead for the sake of decency. Until 1870, those convicted of high treason were tied to a palisade or sledge, similar to a piece of fence made of thin, intertwined branches, and dragged by horse to the place of execution. Once they get there, the criminal will be hanged without a drop to ensure his neck is not broken. Before the criminal dies, his genitals will be cut off and his stomach opened. The criminal's internal organs will then be torn out, and his body will be decapitated. Finally, the body would be divided into 4 quarters. Often, the criminal's head and quarters would be boiled to prevent them from rotting and displayed at the gates of the city as a warning for all to witness. This sadistic method of execution first arose in 1241 to punish William Maurice, who had been convicted of piracy. The Treason Act of 1814 officially removed the disembowelment portion of this method of execution and replaced it with hanging, now with the neck dropped, and post-mortem decapitation. Fracture wheel. Also known as the Catherine's wheel, because it is associated with Saint Catherine of Alexandria, this brutal torture instrument was used during the Middle Ages in Europe. They were popular in France and Germany, and in some cases, were still in use even after the Middle Ages. It gained the name break wheel because it was specifically designed to break the bones of its victims. Men who were convicted of aggravated murder suffered this type of death penalty. The victim is whipped on the wheel, and then a club or iron club is used to beat his limbs. Once victims died from their wounds, the wheel could be used to display their bodies. Sometimes, the victim would face days of torture on the wheel, while other times, the executioner would deliver multiple blows to the chest and abdomen, also known as mercy blows, in order to faster death. The exact mechanism of the wheel used varied from country to country, and some variations of torture instruments even included a wooden cross. Scavism. This was an ancient Persian method of torture reserved for those who had committed serious crimes such as murder or treason. The criminals are kept in a hollow tree trunk or between 2 boats, which is why this method is also called boating, and force-fed with milk and honey. This punishment had to take place in a swamp or in a place where boats could be exposed to sunlight. Not only were they forced to swallow the mixture against their will, but it was also spread all over their exposed body parts. This would attract different types of insects as well as rats, which would eat the victim alive. Victims of scavism also suffered from severe diarrhea after a period of time which left them feeling weak and dehydrated. However, they did not die from dehydration caused by diarrhea, because they were constantly force-fed more milk and honey. This means they can survive for days and even weeks in a little inferno of their own feces, milk, honey, and predatory insects. Eventually, the victim's accumulated feces would generate an avalanche of worms and other insects. Slowly, they would make their way into the victim's body and eat him from the inside, eventually leading to death. Immunization. In this type of punishment, the convicted criminal is placed in a closed place with no exits. Sometimes, this may translate to life imprisonment, while other times, victims are sentenced to death from starvation and dehydration. A photo first published in a 1922 issue of National Geographic magazine depicts a stagnation in action, with a Mongolian woman trapped inside a wooden box in the desert. Photographer Albert Kahn witnessed how the woman was begging for food. He had to leave it in the box, because it would be a major violation of protocol for an anthropologist to interfere with another culture's criminal justice system. According to Kahn, the woman was convicted of adultery. Although there are doubts behind the story of her condemnation to this fate, the image has indisputable authenticity. Victims did not always die of hunger. According to a newspaper report from 1914, people who suffered this fate in China were buried in heavy coffins bound with iron that prevented them from sitting upright or lying down. For only a few minutes a day, they will be able to see sunlight as their food is thrown into their coffins through a small hole. Implementation by elephant. Also known as Gunjar Rao, this form of punishment was mostly used in Asia and India, although there is some evidence of this method being used in the Western world on rare occasions. Execution by elephant has been a form of death penalty in India since the Middle Ages. The victims are often enemy soldiers or civilians who have committed crimes such as theft, tax evasion, and mutiny. Although there are an abundance of animals that can be used for execution, elephants were used because they could be trained to torture and kill criminals. For example, an elephant could be ordered to crush a victim's limbs before delivering the fatal blow to their head. Another example of an elephant cull was witnessed by French traveler François Bernier. In this way, the elephant was trained to chop up criminals with blades attached to their tusks. To publish. During the Middle Ages in Europe, victims were sawed to death for crimes such as witchcraft, adultery, murder, blasphemy, and theft. The Roman Empire preferred to see victims halved horizontally, while the Chinese were more innovative by suspending their victims by their feet and spreading the body vertically. This method was more effective in making victims suffer, because there would be better blood flow to the brain, prolonging the period of consciousness. According to historical documents from the Czech Hussite reform movement, their victims would first suffer the cutting off of their hands and feet before the wounds were cauterized by torch. Only then will the victim be sawn in half. As for ancient Rome, Caligula was known to enjoy a meal while watching people being sawn, reveling in the suffering of the victims during the ultimate punishment. The gallows. In Scotland, this type of death penalty was mostly reserved for convicted murderers. According to the Murder Act of 1752, the bodies of murderers who were executed or hung in chains were dissected. Boycotts had practically disappeared by the late 1770s, although they remained a legal penal option until 1834. One of the reasons that led to the decline of this type of capital punishment was the fact that the body of the criminal was displayed in local areas, which had some obvious disadvantages. The best form of this death penalty is the conviction of Alexander Seelin. He was a servant of a farmer who was convicted of raping and murdering an 11-year-old girl named Elsbeth Lamb in 1810. She was busy herding her father's cattle when he mercilessly attacked her and beat her to death. The notary at the time wanted to issue a death sentence that was considered an ideal response to the scale of the crime, so he decided to execute Seelin in the same place where his victim's body was found and executed. His body was hung in chains to serve as a reminder of the consequences of murder. Algarut. Execution by groats was first introduced in 1812 as an alternative to hanging. At least 736 people were executed by strangulation in Spain during the 19th century. Typically, those who were sentenced to suffer this method of death penalty were convicted of crimes such as murder, banditry, or major acts of terrorism. Prisoners would sit with their backs against a pole, and then a rope loop also attached to the pole would be placed around their necks. The executioners then use a stick inserted into the rope loop to strangle them. There was also a Chinese variation on this method of execution which involved the use of a bowstring. Over time, many improvements were made to ensure that those sentenced to death by strangulation would be killed in a more humane manner. The entire method of strangulation was changed to fit a wooden chair, with shackles for the hands and feet as well as a hinged iron collar that closed around the neck. Along with the wooden seat came a screw/lever mechanism with a star-shaped blade attached to it. This could then be used to enter a prisoner's neck and sever. Stitched in donkey. If you're looking for cruel and unusual forms of torture, look no further than ancient Rome. Take, for example, the torture described by Apuleius, the golden ass, and Lucius, or the ass. The donkey is slaughtered, its stomach is cut open, and its entrails are removed. The accused was then stripped of his clothes and placed in the stomach of the animal. The abdomen was sutured shut, leaving only the accused head outside, preventing suffocation but prolonging the suffering. The donkey's carcass was kept in the sun. It will begin to decompose, with the living victim inside being cooked by the heat. Worms were crawling all over the accused, and vultures were pecking at the decomposing flesh of the animal. Death, although welcome, came slowly to the victim of this torture. Feed for wild boars. Saint Gregory described the horrific torture to which young women were subjected at the hands of the people of Heliopolis during Roman rule. Any virgin who was to be subjected to this torture was first given to the gladiators. After the young woman was no longer a virgin, she was stripped naked in public, and her stomach was slit, causing her insides to spill out. It was stuffed with handfuls of barley, and sewn back together, only to be given to the wild boars. She'll be torn after that. To cut. In ancient Rome, the higher your status, the more people you were allowed to kill without consequences. For example, the emperor would deal with anyone he wanted. A general could move against a lieutenant or an ordinary citizen, and soldiers could go after ordinary citizens. Climbing the social ladder was forbidden. If an ordinary citizen decided to penetrate an unwilling soldier, the punishment was public castration. If a soldier willingly allowed an ordinary citizen to penetrate him, he would be publicly disemboweled. These rules, coupled with true love between men, really muddy the waters. It was easy for anyone to accuse a man of breaking rank or willingly submitting to penetration by a man of lesser status. Bona culi. The Romans also began to use pena culei, which meant punishment for the sack. The criminal was sewn into a basic leather bag and drowned, death the ultimate goal. The general consensus is that the pena culei first appeared in Titus Livy's History of Rome. In it, Livy describes how Marcus Publius Malleolus was sewn up in a sack and thrown into the sea in 101 BC for killing his mother. Livy's version of events seems tame compared to later versions of the punishment, which involved the use of live animals. According to Emperor Justinian's laws from 530 AD, this is not an execution by sword or fire, or by any other form of ordinary punishment, but the criminal is sewn up in a sack with a dog and a rooster, and a snake and a monkey. And in this dreary prison he is cast into the sea or the river. Fortunately, the ancient Romans retained this rarely given punishment for parricide, that is, the killing of a parent or other relative. The tortured senator. Emperor Caligula was just as cruel as old Tiberius. At one point, he had an open slot in the Senate. The senator survived, and Caligula ordered his eyes removed. Hot pliers were then used to remove his internal organs. To add insult to injury, the senator was cut in half and torn to pieces. According to Roman belief, death was not punishment, but liberation. Torture was punishment, and death was allowed only after a certain amount of pain and horror had been felt. Nailed into a barrel. Some people were meant to suffer longer than others before triggering a beautiful death. During the reign of Emperor Domitian, Christians were tortured in the most horrific ways. One of the most disgusting tortures that was performed was smearing a Christian with honey and milk. The victim was then pinned to a barrel and force-fed food infested with parasites. The parasites feed on the entrails of the victim, whose body has begun to rot inside the barrel. After about 2 weeks of this torture, the victim finally died and became a martyr for the Christian religion. Buried alive. Emperor Nero was happy to bury people alive. He reserved this punishment almost exclusively on virgins who broke their vows of chastity. In one account, Nero forced himself on the priestess Rubria. As punishment, she was buried inside a small cave and left to starve. Another torture that Nero supported was having the accused dig his own grave. After digging, a stake was placed inside the grave. The accused was then tied and pushed into the grave. If his crime is minor, he will be pushed until the stake pierces his heart. Anyone convicted of a heinous crime was driven until the stake mortally wounded him. He was then left to die in excruciating pain or be buried alive. Eaten through the middle. Executioners often used animals to carry out their brutal acts, as was the case with cauldron torture. For this particular cruelty, a starving animal, such as a rat, dog, or cat, was placed inside a small cauldron. The opening of the cauldron was then fixed on the defendant's stomach. The executioner held a flame at the back of the cauldron, making the inside extremely hot. The animal will panic and try to escape. The only soft floor that was able to make its way out was through the accused abdomen. Basket. One bizarre form of torture involved stripping a person naked and placing them in a large, loosely woven basket. The basket was then lifted into a tree containing a large active beehive. The bees quickly got angry, and stung the person inside the basket to death. The accused was supposed to suffer in agony for as long as possible. However, there have been cases where the victim of this torture died relatively quickly due to an allergy to bee stings. Solid. The ancient Romans loved good steel. It was at one time the primary method used to torture and kill countless numbers of slaves. Crucifixion did not always involve nailing the accused to a cross. Sometimes, the accused was stripped naked, hooded, and tied to a cross or thorn. Then he was flogged, sometimes, until he died. If the accused was not supposed to die by continuous flogging, the next procedure involved pinning his hands to the crossbar. He was then lifted onto a planted pole, and his feet were nailed to the pole. He may be left there to die a slow death, or his thighs may be broken to help hasten his end. In some cases, the accused may be hung upside down from the pole. Other times, the executioner would drive the shaft through the accused's genitals. The methods used varied from executioner to executioner, with no specific method of crucifixion for everyone. Mithridates, 401 BC. Being eaten alive, scaphism, the worst punishments in human history. Mithridates killed Cyrus, the younger brother of Artaxerxes II, in battle in 404 BC. Plutarch states that Artaxerxes was very pleased with Cyrus' death and gave Mithridates lavish gifts and asked him to keep everything a secret so that the king could claim that he had killed Cyrus. Mithridates got drunk at a feast and bragged about Cyrus' death by his own hand. When Artaxerxes heard this, he was so angry that he ordered Mithridates to be executed as follows. 2 boats were carved to fit each other, and in one, Mithridates was posed naked and smeared from head to toe with milk and honey. He was forced to drink some of it as well. Then the other boat was pinned to him until his hands, feet, and head were sticking out. In this state, it was left anchored in the lake for several days. The flying insects found him and began eating the milk and honey all over his body, biting and stinging him as they did so. The next day, the top boat was removed, he was again doused with milk and honey and forced to eat more, then left floating in the lake. He finally began to urinate and defecate on himself in the boat, attracting more insects, which then began to enter. It enters its body through its various openings, nests inside it, and lays eggs that hatch. Thus the vermin ate from his eyes and entered his sinuses. In this case, he died after 17 days of torment. The Dunay brothers, 1314. The love affair that made the 100 Years' War inevitable. Gautier and Philippe Aunay were knights of the court of Philip IV of France. In 1313, Philip's daughter, Queen Isabella of England, gave embroidered purses to her brothers Louis and Charles and their wives Blanche and Margaret. Later that year, she and King Edward II hosted a large banquet in London for their French guests. Isabella noticed that the purses she had given to Blanche and Marguerite were carried by the Dunay brothers. Isabella suspected that her 2 sisters-in-law were having illicit affairs, and told her father the following year. The 2 brothers were placed under surveillance. Knights tended to come and go frequently to the Parisian guard tower Tour de Nesle built by Philip II. The whole incident became known as the Tour de Nesle affair. Philip eventually went public with the adultery and had both men and women arrested. Blanche and Margaret were found guilty, had their heads shaved, and were imprisoned for life. Gautier and Philippe of Aunay were tortured until they confessed their guilt and were then executed on charges of lèse majesté, that is, insulting majesty. This was seen as an extremely humiliating form of treason and required the harshest punishment. The brothers were accordingly castrated and their reproductive organs thrown to dogs. They were then skinned alive, molten lead and sulfur poured over their exposed bodies, broken on the wheel, and finally beheaded. Alcide King, 1705. Being sawed in half, the worst punishments in human history. A king who was a governor, Cade, during the reign of the Sultan of Morocco, Moulay Ismail bin Sharif. In 1705, one of the Sultan's sons, Moulay Muhammad, attempted a rebellion led by Malik and others. Once the rebellion was put down, Malik was considered the most responsible and deserved the maximum punishment. The Sultan's wife was angry that Malik had beheaded one of her cousins, Ali Bukhara. Thus, in September or October, Moulay Ismail asked his chief carpenter if his saws were capable of cutting a person in half, and the carpenter replied that they were. Then the carpenter was assigned the job of executioner. He wondered whether the millet should be deployed in half sagittal, along the spine, or transversely, across the waist. Ismail Samai answered, starting at the head. The carpenter packed 2 saws with cloth so that Melik would not know how he would be executed, lest he would try to escape, and Melik was taken to the public square where up to 4,000 relatives and friends had gathered. Melik, who had been quietly smoking his pipe, was stripped naked and tied face down to a board placed on a sawhorse. The executioners had intended to start at his head, but Bouchera's sons said they should start between Melik's legs lest he die too quickly. Melik screamed horribly as the blade slowly cut him in half along his spine until it reached his navel. He was still conscious and begging for water when the executioners placed the blade on his head and slowly sawed him in 2. Jan van Leyden, Bernhard Krichting, and Bernhard Knipperdoling, 1536. The history of the mysterious hanging cages of this medieval church. These 3 men were leaders in the Munster Rebellion. They attempted to overthrow Catholic hegemony in favor of Anabaptist Protestantism in Germany. They drove the Bishop Mayor Franz von Waldeck out of the city. He immediately assembled an army of mercenaries and imposed a siege. The Protestants led Jean Matisse until he was killed outside the city walls. The siege lasted more than a year, and most of the population starved to death as a result. On June 24, 1535, Waldeck's army finally broke through the walls and regained control. Knipperdoling and Krichting were immediately arrested. Jan was found hiding in the basement. On January 22, 1536, they were taken to a temporary platform in the market square, tied to an iron stake, and fitted with iron collars so they could not move. The iron tongs were then heated until they were very hot. They were held in the middle like scissors and shaped like modern spaghetti tentacles. Jean was stripped to the waist, and his flesh was torn apart, one hot bite at a time, for a full hour. Knipperdoling could not see him, but he heard him howl in pain as his flesh was torn to his bones. Knipperdoling attempted suicide by strangling himself with his iron collar. He was then tied up in a way that immobilized him. After an entire hour of suffering, his flesh was torn into large pieces, and Jean's tongue was completely torn from his throat. Then a red-hot dagger was plunged into his heart. Then it was Knipperdoling's turn for 1 hour, then Krichting's turn. Their bodies were locked in iron cages, hoisted to the top of the tower of St. Lambert's Cathedral, and left there to rot for 50 years as a warning. The cages are still hanging there today. Balthasar Gerard, 1584. Balthasar Gerard was an example of this. Philip of Spain placed a bounty on the head of the Dutch Prince William. On July 10, 1584, after dinner at his house, William went downstairs, where Gerard suddenly emerged and fired one of his 2 wheel-lock pistols into William's chest. He collapsed and died instantly, and Gerard fled. But he tripped over some trash and was arrested. He did not deny his actions and was tried and convicted. The court ordered Gerard to be tortured for 3 days. The first time, he was hung with his hands tied behind him on a pole and was lifted and fell, dislocating his shoulders. Then they flogged him with a whip. The wounds were smeared with honey, and a goat came and licked it with its rough tongue, but it did not come near, so it rubbed his wounds with salt. The next day, he was hung from the pole again, with 300-pound weights tied to each of his big toes for 30 minutes. A shoe made of untreated leather was placed on his feet and placed over a fire, the heat of which shrank the shoe and crushed the bones in his feet. The next day they were robbed and his cooked meat was taken with them. The branding irons were then pressed into his armpits. His chest muscles were cut, the wounds were rubbed with salt, and pins were placed under all of his fingernails and toenails. He was then dressed in a shirt soaked in alcohol, and poured burning lard on him. On July 14, pincers were used to tear off his flesh. Then his right hand was burned with a red-hot iron. Then his abdomen was cut open, his intestines were removed, his genitals were cut off, and his arms and legs were cut off. His lips were seen trembling until his chest was split open, and his heart was ripped out and thrown in his face. If you liked the video, do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell to receive upcoming videos, and if you want more, leave us in the comments. How was tickling used in the past as a means of torture through goats? Although tickling causes a lot of laughter, the tickling sensation can turn into pain. In one study, researchers found simultaneous expressions of pleasure and dissatisfaction with tickling, and another research found that tickling can cause a pain-like sensation. The ancient history of torture stated that tickling was used as a method of torture, starting from ancient Rome to China. Tickle torture is a type of ill treatment. Several methods are used. One of them uses sugar, salt, goats, and the victim's feet. Then the victim's feet are rubbed with salt or sugar, and the goats are inserted to lick them. This doesn't sound so bad, but once the sugar or salt is gone and you've finished with a few laughs, the goats keep up the constant licking, swallowing your feet and eventually tearing the skin. Tickle torture can also lead to shortness of breath, dizziness, or vomiting. Cases of tickle torture have been documented everywhere from medieval England to ancient Japan and Nazi concentration camps. Methods of torture using tickling. The Washington Post published a report on the use of tickling as a means of torture in wars, including its use in Nazi concentration camps during World War II, as tickle torture was synonymous with death. BCE. The Han Dynasty in China in 206 BC used the tickling technique as a reliable punishment that left no marks, and there was no physical evidence of torture on the sacrificed body. In Nazi camps. A survivor of the Nazi camps narrated that the guards used to tickle the prisoners before killing them, and they also used sexual titillation as a brutal form of torture, according to a report by the History Addicted website. Tickle torture in modern times. It may be used by special operations forces in interrogations, as a method of non-lethal torture for governments to use to obtain information from a suspect. What happens in the body when tickled? Below the skin are millions of small nerve endings that alert the brain to touch and exposure to things such as heat and cold. When light nerve endings are stimulated by another person's fingers or by a feather, they send a message through the nervous system to the brain, which analyzes the message, according to the Science website. The effect of a light touch that leads to a tickling sensation is the result of the analysis of two areas of the brain, the somatosensory cortex and the skin sensory receptors. Why do we choose the armpits, soles of the feet and neck for tickling? The underarm area contains the axillary vein and artery that connect unhindered to the heart, because the rib cage does not provide protection for the chest cavity at the armpit. The same applies to the neck, as the neck contains all kinds of vital materials, and includes two of the most important arteries in the human body, the carotid artery, which supplies the brain with blood, and the trachea, which brings air to the lungs. Mongolians never clean their clothes. The Mongolians of the time of Genghis Khan believed that polluting the water would anger the dragons that controlled its cycle. They were afraid that if they polluted the water, the gods would send a storm to destroy their homes, so they did not wash anything. Bathing in running water or washing your clothes was forbidden. Most Mongolian fighters did not change their clothes. At most, they beat their coats to get the lice out and then put them back on. They wore the same thing, day after day, until it literally rotted and couldn't be worn anymore. They didn't wash the dishes with water either. Instead, they washed their plates with the broth left over from the last meal. Then they poured the used broth back into the pot and cooked their next meal in it. It was smelly, but they took pride in it. There was a strength to their stench. It would be an honor if a great Khan gave someone his mantle, not just because he had his clothes, but because he was now able to bear the Khan's stench. 9. They learned to ride a horse when they were 3 years old. As soon as Mongolians could walk, they learned to ride horses. Every family had a horse, whether they were rich or poor, soldiers or farmers. Even shepherds took care of their flocks on horseback. They had to be groomed at an early age, so they started when they were 3 years old. Mongolians had saddles specifically for children, designed with some extra safety features to make sure they wouldn't get hurt. They wanted their children to start playing sports as soon as possible. It makes a big difference. When the Europeans saw them, they responded that the little girls in Mongolia were better at riding horses than most European men. The children also learned archery. Once they started riding, they were given small bows and learned to shoot. For Mongolians in the time of the great Khans, riding a horse and shooting a bow was as essential as learning to walk. 8. They drank blood from a cut vein in their horses' necks. The Mongolian army covered incredible distances. In one day, they could travel 80 miles, 129 kilometers, an absolutely unheard of distance in their time. It took an intense and fierce journey to do this, and they did not have time to stop to eat. To make the journey possible, they would put raw meat on the backs of their horses. It is believed that this was to tenderize the meat so they could eat it on the go, although this is debated. Some now believe that the meat was intended for the horse, and was meant to help heal their sores as they undertook incredible journeys. Marco Polo claimed that these warriors would ride for 10 days straight without stopping long enough to light a fire. When they were thirsty, they would make a hole in their horses' necks and drink the blood that came out. The horses helped them drink as well. They would ride the female horses whenever possible and milk them when they stopped. Then they'd take that milk with them, let it ferment and turn into an alcoholic drink for the road. 7. They cut the breasts of animals and slaughter them. Mongolians hardly eat vegetables. From time to time, they would gather some wild plants or eat some of the food provided to them by the surrendering army, but they mostly relied on meat and dairy products. Their diet, essentially, was the exact opposite of vegetarianism, and the way they prepared it was the exact opposite of kosher. If they wanted to slaughter an animal, they tied the animal, stuck a knife in its chest, and then cut it. Then they would reach her heart and press on it to fill the corpse with blood. They would tear out all his internal organs and cook them. Every part of the animal's body is used, usually boiled in a pot of broth, but on special occasions, cooked on a skewer. The blood would be drained from the body and turned into sausage. Normally, they would eat lamb, but they would eat horses when they could. Horses are usually saved for special occasions, but they will eat whatever horse meat they can. According to one missionary who went to Mongolia, they ate until the Maras gave birth. 6. A Mongolian man can have up to 30 wives. Mongolians were strict about sex outside of marriage. If a man is caught with a married woman, his lips may be cut off. If they were in bed together, he could be killed. If caught with an unmarried virgin, both the man and the woman were killed. However, as long as she married them, the man could have as many women as he wanted, or, more accurately, as many women as he could afford. He had to pay a dowry for each one, and was expected to provide her with her own tent to live in. Some Mongolian men had 30 wives, and the Khans had hundreds. Women had accepted that this was life. It is alleged that after some men spent the night with his wife, he would invite the other wives to share a drink together. 5. The younger son inherited his father's wives. When a Mongolian's life ended, they would make sure his wives were taken care of. His land and possessions were divided between his sons, with the best reward going to the youngest. He will get his father's house, his slaves, and his wives as well. The boy is not expected to marry his mother, but is expected to provide for all of his father's other wives. Although there were no rules stating that he had to do this, he was allowed to take it as his own. It was not uncommon for a young man who had lost his father to take his stepmothers as wives and bring them to his tent. 4. They used psychological warfare. One of the main ways in which Mongolians became effective killers was through the use of psychology. They couldn't conquer so many countries by fighting alone, they needed as many of them as possible to surrender without having to waste the lives of their men. No matter the circumstances, they would hide their numbers. If the opponent's army is larger than their own, they will place dummies on reserve horses or light additional fires to appear more powerful. If their army was larger, they would ride their horses in single file, with branches tied to their tails to hide them in a cloud of dust. They were experts at scaring people. They were traveling with their tents that they could set up before the siege as mobile homes. In at least one case, they used the colors of these tents to terrorize people inside the city walls. First, they set up white tents and told them that if they surrendered now they would be rescued. If they do not surrender, they will set up red tents and tell them that only men will be killed. If the people were still not ready to fight, they would set up black tents, telling them that everyone inside would die. 3. They slaughtered entire cities. The key to their psychological terror was their reputation for brutality. They needed their enemies to believe that if they did not surrender, everyone in the city would be horribly killed. They didn't use any tricks to gain this reputation, they actually did it. If the city didn't surrender, the Mongolian horde would slaughter everyone inside. They gathered the women and children and slaughtered them all. Sometimes they would round up cats and dogs and kill them for good measure. Their heads would be removed and a pyramid would be made of their skulls so anyone passing by would know what happened if you angered the Khan. The most horrific thing was what they did to pregnant women. According to an Arab writer, the Mongolians did not stop killing them. They were going to rip open her stomach and kill the fetus inside. 2. They had to kill the nobles without shedding blood. Mongolians believe that blood contains the spiritual essence of a person. They did not dare to shed the blood of a nobleman, thinking that he would desecrate the ground on which he had fallen. Therefore, when they killed kings, they had to find other ways to do so. Usually, the nobles were suffocated or drowned. If a member of the Khan's family betrayed him, he was usually wrapped in a carpet and thrown into a body of water. But sometimes, they get creative. Jeek Khan took care of one of his rivals by suturing every hole in her body shut and pushing her into the river. They had to get creative with the enemy nobles, too. In one case, they trapped the Russian princes under a board and held a feast above them to strangle them without shedding their blood. In another story, Genghis Khan killed a man by pouring molten silver into his eyes. 1. They threw the diseased corpses over the city walls. The Mongolian army was probably the first to use biological warfare. During their invasion of Europe, they were infected with the Black Plague, and decided to use it to their advantage. Their enemies were holed up inside the city of Kaffa, where the Mongols besieged them. When the Black Plague began killing their people, they realized they could not survive forever. They wanted to make as big an impact as possible before they left, so they threw their dead over the city walls. Any Mongolian who died of the plague was put on a catapult and flown over the walls. On the other hand, the people tried to get rid of these bodies by throwing them into the sea, but this led to the contamination of their water supplies. The plague quickly spread throughout the city. A few people escaped over the city walls and ran west, but it was too late for them. They were already carrying the plague, and as they ran westward, they spread it across Europe. At the end of the video, don't forget to leave us your comments about these terrifying facts. If you liked the video, do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell to receive 2 new videos.